So this sermon today is not the sermon I had planned to preach. When I imagined today's message, it was all about my gratitude for you, for this congregation, for your support and encouragement as I have moved from being a congregant to being a seminarian to being ordained last Saturday. I am full of gratitude. I also imagined that I would preach about transitions because I am in a transitional moment, and so are you. I'm preparing to move to Illinois and begin serving a congregation there, and you're preparing to welcome Reverend Shelley to your congregation. So the short version of that sermon today is thank you. And I will be watching with interest to learn how your period of developmental ministry unfolds. So I have to confess that in this moment of grief and rage across our country, I have been feeling inadequate to preach to you this morning. This week, our streets have erupted in protest against the culture of white supremacy that permeates our living. I'm a white woman who has benefited from this culture of white supremacy, and I have helped through my actions and my inaction to perpetuate that culture. This is the culture and the system that knelt on the neck of a man named George Floyd, knelt there for almost 9 minutes. A system that could not be moved even when he said, "I can't breathe," when he called out for his mama. What can I bring to you good people that will provide relief or soothing or challenge or provocation? How can I adequately address this gaping wound in our collective psyche? I wrestled with these questions. And then I realized that I, as a white person, I am not the one who should or can soothe anyone. My job as a white person is to listen to Black people and people of color, and to learn, and then to do what they ask of me. And then, since I'm a minister, my job is also to pass on what I've learned. So I spent this week listening and learning, and I'll share a little bit of it with you. This week, one thing I did was watch a sermon from the Reverend Karen Hutt. She's a Black UU minister in Minneapolis. I think Sarah or Amanda will put the link in the chat box for you. There it is. Thanks, Sarah. If you don't get to save the link, you can always search on YouTube for First Universalist Minneapolis and look for the May 31st sermon. I recommend that you watch this. You should know ahead of time that the audio doesn't sync exactly with the video, but do not let that distract you from the message. In her sermon, Reverend Hutt describes her family's experience of being ravaged by white people throughout decades. From her great-great-grandfather, who was murdered by white children for fun, to her grandfather, who with his friend was chased by a white mob and who watched his friend be caught and lynched for the entertainment of those who gathered, to her own experiences of being assaulted and in 1 year being pulled over 15 times for driving while Black. Her litany of violence delivered with such a calm demeanor is stunning. And for those of us who are white, that much violence perpetuated on one family is almost beyond imagining. But precisely because it is out of my realm of experience, I must listen and I must learn. This week, I also watched video after video of incidents of police brutality against Black bodies. I read about the history of policing in America, how it came out of fugitive slave laws. I read proposals for the gradual abolition of police departments and the ideas for the structures that would take their place. I watched Black leaders, many of them very young. I watched them lead marches and protests and movements. I sought out music and poetry and art that expressed the experiences of Black people like those I've shared with you today. I listened and I learned. I listened and I learned, and I know that I have a lifetime of listening and learning and unlearning yet to do. This system of white supremacy depends on white people being oblivious to it, and oblivious we are. It's not like Black people have not expressed their pain in the past. Sojourner Truth asked, "Ain't I a woman?" Frederick Douglass stated that the white man's happiness cannot be purchased by the Black man's misery. Langston Hughes told us, "America was never America to me." Maya Angelou wrote of a caged bird singing of freedom. Placards worn by protesters in the 1960s stated, "I am a man." Eric Garner and George Floyd said, "I can't breathe." George Floyd called out for his mama. How powerful the workings of white supremacy culture. Those voices have been crying out for 400 years in this country, and yet white people, once the current furor dies down, can return to their cocoon of privilege and still fail to see. That's how white supremacy will continue unless we, the white people, change. These past 2 weeks in which the rage has spilled into the streets, and it won't be quelled by requests to, quote, be civil, which to me seems like another way to say, stop making me uncomfortable. It feels like we're on the brink of something new. Over the past few days, I've read that the Pentagon, without consulting the White House, disarmed federalized National Guard troops in Washington and sent the regular troops that had been moved to the city back to their bases. I read that the Marines directed their corps commanders to remove Confederate battle flags or their depictions from workplaces, common access areas, and public areas on their installations. In Denver, a federal court issued a restraining order against Denver police, prohibiting them from using chemicals or projectiles against peaceful protesters. These actions and so many others that we're hearing about give me some hope that things might finally be changing. It seems that the more white supremacy is exposed, the more the system is shifting. In addition to these official actions, I've seen a heightened level of awareness in other white people of the lived experiences of Black people and the understanding that the problem is systemic. It's more than just individual behavior. The problem is a racist system that we all take part in. But although the problem is bigger than our individual behavior, our individual actions do matter. I am sorely tempted to put on my rose-colored glasses and settle into my comfortable life and assume that everything's going to turn out okay now that these shifts are starting to happen. But I know that's not how change happens, and that systemic change will require long-term action. Martin Luther King wrote in the letter from a Birmingham jail, "Human progress never rolls on in wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of men willing to be co-workers with God." Men and women, of course. Several years ago, Ty Emery Span Wilson preached at UUCL. Some of you might remember that. I served as his worship associate one time. Ty Emery is a Black man, an activist, and a religious educator in the UCC tradition. In one of his sermons, Ty Emery encouraged us to get involved in movements for social change. He outlined various roles that people could take. They could be the ones holding the megaphone or marching. They could organize movements, protests, and actions with emails or social media. They could feed and fund organizers and protesters. They could educate other people about the issues. They could support those who are most affected by the issue at hand. At this moment that feels pivotal, I hope you can find yourself somewhere in one of those roles. Whether you can find yourself in one of those roles or not, if you're a white person, your first step is to educate yourself about white supremacy and being anti-racist. I know that Reverend Aaron has been sharing some links of ways to learn more. I encourage you to learn white supremacy's characteristics and its history. I encourage you to interrogate yourself and find where white supremacy hides in your thoughts and your feelings. Bring it into the light, because as the saying goes, sunlight is the best disinfectant. In the reading earlier, the poet and minister, Reverend Teresa Soto, tasked us with remembering the future, a future that we would like to live, saying, quote, "There is no more time for pretending that everything can be all right without your care, without your attention." I believe that God, which is to say goodness, which is to say love or connection or compassion, this God has no other hands or feet than ours. God needs us as co-workers, to quote Martin Luther King. If our hands and our feet are white, in order to use our hands and feet wisely in this time, we must listen and learn. We must be humble and curious and kind. We must not expect our Black kin to educate us beyond what they have already freely offered, but we must find other white people who want to learn with us. Listening and learning, which lead to action. That's how we can become adequate to this moment. May it be so.